Sound coming through okay? Okay, so this morning we'll spend the first half talking about glomerular filtration, and some of it's an expansion of the Starling laws that we started on last time. And then in the second hour we'll talk a little bit about renal pathology. So first, case 4. A 68-year-old man sought help at a hospital because he didn't feel good. It was determined that he was experiencing urinary urgency, hesitance, and diminished stream force. He reports urinating about 5 times a night and every hour during the day. Physical examination revealed a large abdominal mass and an enlarged prostate. His serum creatinine, we don't know what that is yet, but his serum creatinine is extremely high, which is somewhat indicative of almost zero glomerular filtration rate. And when his bladder was catheterized after peeing, he produced 1,200 mils. That's less than 1,200 mils. And you know, you've all got an abdomen, and you can imagine how much pressure that causes if you can't get rid of it. So it's really kind of a simple plumbing problem. His enlarged prostate presumably is obstructing urine flow, and his bladder is building up with fluid, urine. So does that have any other consequences? Obviously it does, because I told you that the creatinine was high, and this was indicative of virtually no glomerular filtration rate at all. So in very simple terms, you know, if you have a hose pipe and you pinch it, the pressure builds up and you reduce the flow. And glomerular filtration is a flow. So anything that you do to obstruct urine outflow severely will tend to affect glomerular filtration. And if you have no glomerular filtration or very little glomerular filtration, then you start to have problems with things building up in the blood. So pretty straightforward. So what I'd like to do, and I do have a note here. Costanzo and some of the textbooks, they start with the very basics in renal physiology and they go straight into math. And I'd heard that you guys don't like math a lot, so why don't we learn a little bit about what the kidney's actually doing, and then I'll pick up on the math, which I promise to make easy, maybe on Wednesday. Okay? So what we're going to do, before we start doing the math, we're going to talk about filtration, and then tomorrow we're going to talk about transport processes in the tubule. Then we'll do the quantitative stuff. So glomerular filtration, it's the net filtration pressure times the Kf, or basically the permeability. And if you remember, you know, this kind of relates to our pressure equals flow times resistance equation. Does it all make sense if Kf is proportional to 1 over the resistance? Does that kind of fit the equation now that you're all familiar with? Kf, sorry. It's proportional to. So what we're going to try to do is, since I've stated the net filtration pressure is a major determinant, we're going to look at the Starling forces and try and determine what those pressures are. So let's start. Remember, I had said that the hydrostatic pressure at the glomerular capillary is pretty high, and I'm going to feed you a figure of 45, but it doesn't drop much as it passes through the glomerulus. So in other words, the hydrostatic pressure is pretty well maintained, much better than it is in a lot of other vascular beds. And again, remember, I'm giving you numbers. You can go to any textbook you want. You'll probably get a whole bunch of different numbers because we can't measure those things real easily. So I'm just giving you some for instance numbers. So with a high hydrostatic pressure, there is a pressure that wants to cause filtration, and we're just going to call it, I think, PGC, the pressure in the glomerular capillary. Is that what's listed there? Yes. So, looks like it's about 44, 45, but there's also a back pressure, and I think it's called PBS, pressure in Bowman space. Yes. In the kidney, although in a lot of other vascular beds, it's pretty close to zero, the interstitial pressure. Here, the hydrostatic pressure in Bowman space is somewhere around 10. Okay, so it's a positive pressure. Now, there is also a force that opposes filtration, and I'm going to combine this, so it's pi GC. So, and all this says is that the proteins in the blood that don't get filtered tend to generate an oncotic force in that direction. Straightforward? Okay. Now, there's a number of different ways we can do it. We can say, well, we really need to determine the pi in Bowman space also and take that off. When I use the term pi, I tend to think in terms of the net oncotic force that opposes filtration. So I tend to combine those. There is, yes, there is a little bit of protein in Bowman space, but mostly I'm just going to call it pi, the oncotic force due to the proteins in the plasma that oppose filtration. Okay. Are we going to feed in values? Yes, we are. So, so the net filtration pressure, and you'll see it in books in different forms, sometimes PUF for net ultrafiltration pressure. Is that what Costanzo uses? I think so. So it's going to equal PGC plus, minus PBS and minus, and I'm just going to round it off at pi, the oncotic pressure. And let me feed in some numbers. PGC, I think we say, was 45. And I told you PBS about 10. And I'm going to feed in a value of that. So the net ultrafiltration pressure, despite the fact that I told you that this was a massive filtration, the net ultrafiltration pressure is only somewhere around 6 millimeters of mercury. You, as M1s and M2s, while you do the step exams, you have to work calculations like this. And you might think, well, it's kind of trite because, you know, we don't really know any real numbers. But the step exams and myself think that you need to be able to manipulate these numbers to give you an understanding of what's actually going on. So if you're asked to calculate ultrafiltration pressure, we've got these values, which we know we couldn't actually measure. We also get, this is kind of an odd number. So 29, but it changes through the length of the capillary. It's a very variable number, so that's actually kind of a net mean value for pi. In other words, incredibly contrived, but suck it up, get used to it. That's kind of the way they do the calculations. Okay? Just be aware that it is a very contrived number. Okay, so calculation's pretty simple. Let me feed in some numbers. So glomerular filtration rate is usually something like 120 mils per minute. This is a horrible color, isn't it? Can you see it? This is usually about 6, and we won't worry about the units, but that would be, what, about 20. You can work out the units, but I don't think it's something we need to do. And so that's kind of the normal values that you might expect in this kind of calculation. So, good. Oh, I'm telling you, it's a massive filtration. And I think that I've already told you that the Kf in the glomerular capillary is particularly high. In other words, the glomerular capillary has a pretty high permeability to fluid filtration. Okay, so much higher than in other tissues. And so this is my massive filtration. Remember, there was a little bit of urine, and that's 125 mils per minute, and you think, yeah, so what? I know that you guys are hard to impress. I am going to try to impress you. How long do you think it would take me to filter that much fluid? How much? I tell you what, remember I'd said that I wanted to bribe you for any kind of engagement? Any number will earn you something. Any number. 24 hours. Who said that? Hey. Smart person. Doesn't matter whether you get it right or wrong, so long as you make a guess. Just over 2 hours. Okay. You are impressed now? Hey! So we actually filter about 180 liters a day, and that's about 1/10 of that. Okay, about 18 to 20 liters. Okay, so filtration is massive. We process a lot. I am so thrilled that I impressed you guys. Okay, let's flip the page. Any questions?
Are there medications that will affect the Kf in the filtration?
So the question is, are there any medications that will affect the Kf? And the answer is yes. And I'll talk about this maybe a little bit more later, but the Kf is, basically Kf is permeability. A permeability of the glomerular membrane to fluid transmission. And so one of the things that affects permeability is the area. And we have mesangial cells, intraglomerular mesangial cells, gosh, that's hard to say, that are actually contractile. And so the intraglomerular mesangial cells can contract the glomerulus. And that could have a couple of effects. One, it could have changed the flow, and two, it can change the surface area of the glomerular capillary. So the answer is yes. Any vasoconstrictor, or most vasoconstrictors or dilators can have an effect on the intraglomerular mesangial cells and affect KF that way. Okay. Where was I? Oh, yeah, we were going to. So I'll reproduce that first diagram there. Starling forces. And we're starting at one end of the capillary, the beginning here, and we'll go through to the end, and this is the pressure and this is the length. So the PGC, okay, it's a blood hydrostatic pressure. I've got to use red. Starts at 45 and goes down to 44. Okay, trick question, just to see if you guys understand. If it was 45 at the beginning and 45 at the end, what would happen? No flow, right? You have to, the pressure has to, you have to flow down the pressure gradient. Okay, and so then there's PBS, which was about 10, I think we said, right? 10 is PBS. And you know, that doesn't change. And then we have an oncotic pressure. And I think we said it was a mean of 29. But actually the pressure is, the filtration is so marked that you actually, as you concentrate the proteins, the oncotic pressure actually rises. So massive filtration. I'll say that again. So as you filter fluid out of the blood or out of the plasma, what's left behind is the proteins, and the proteins become more concentrated, and therefore the more concentrated proteins tend to elevate the oncotic pressure, and that's why it rises. And I think what we should do, let's just combine this and combine this, because these are the forces opposing filtration. And let's make a new line. I'm going to use blue. Okay, so that's the combination of this line and this line. I think it's kind of obvious at this point that when the forces for filtration equal the forces opposing filtration, you should have no net movement of fluid, yes? And this is what the term, and I don't know whether you actually really have to remember this, but that term is called the filtration equilibrium. I'll write it up. So now going back, remember I said that you're given a value for the mean oncotic pressure, where you can see that it's a mean oncotic pressure and it's changing. Okay. So I'm going to leave this up. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later. The filtration is going to be proportional to basically the area under this difference here. So at this point there's a lot of filtration, a little less, a little less, little less, 0. Yes. Oh, so why don't I just put that in? The area. And we will come back and use that a little bit later. Questions? The numbers that I've used up there are Costanzo's numbers. Okay. So, that's the basics of what's going on. If we flip the page, we are going, page 4, we're going to look at physiological regulation of GFR. So, we don't really have a clue what regulates GFR. However, the USLME people will find a way to test you on it, even though we don't really know what the fine mechanisms are. What they do need you to do is kind of figure out what would happen if we vasodilate or vasoconstrict. And I am going to use the Costanzo diagrams there. I think they look like this. Oh yeah. Afferent, efferent. And this is the filtration barrier here, okay? So remember, Costanzo's a physiologist too, so she likes to do things in very simple format also. So the question is, how do you manipulate GFR? Realize that the primary determinant is PGC. Okay? So what might change PGC? Well, first, blood pressure. Okay? Blood pressure drives capillary pressure. And so under normal circumstances, we have a blood pressure that helps us to filter things. If that blood pressure dropped drastically, it would lower PGC, and it would impede our ability to filter. And indeed, from a clinical standpoint, that's very relevant, because hypotension, severe dehydration, you may not have enough pressure head to maintain filtration at the kidney. And sure enough, something as simple as hypotension or dehydration can cause a massive reduction in GFR. We don't do real well if there's a massive reduction in GFR. So blood pressure is obviously one. Blood pressure. But also, internally, we can vasoconstrict or vasodilate. So here's the afferent arteriole. If we constrict here, first of all, what effects is it going to have on renal plasma flow? Constrict. It's got to go down, right? Yes. What about GFR? If you constrict here, the pressure falls beyond here, PGC falls. So GFR will also fall. Okay. What about the efferent arteriole? The afferent and efferent arterioles are just like any other arterioles. They constrict and they can change resistance. So if you constrict here at the efferent arteriole, what happens to renal plasma flow? Got to go down, yeah. What about GFR? So if I squeeze the tube here, it can tend to raise this, right? So that could go up. So conceivably, GFR could actually go up. And I say conceivably, why? Okay, so let's say, what's our normal renal plasma flow? About 600. And our GFR is what, 125? So what would happen if I constricted that efferent arteriole so much that I only now had a renal plasma flow of 100 mils per minute? Would the GFR still go up? No, I mean, you can't have more GFR than you have renal plasma flow. So, in other words, this can hold true for small constrictions of the efferent arteriole. And I think Costanzo addresses this at least to some extent. So there's kind of a biphasic response. If you constrict this mildly, the GFR could go up. But if you keep on constricting it more and more, it would tend to go down. So this is the sort of manipulation that you're going to be asked to do for STEP exams. Yeah, I've got a note. Costanzo addresses this on page 265, or at least to some extent. Okay. So who cares? We care. Is efferent arteriolar constriction important? One of the ideas is that angiotensin II, which is a vasoconstrictor, tends to have a preferential constriction at the efferent arteriole. And it's in Costanzo, it's in a number of other textbooks too. There are those that disagree, but that's okay. So if there's a preferential constriction here, angiotensin II could raise PGC and theoretically could control blood filtration rate that way. And the only reason I mention that is that one of the prevailing theories for angiotensin receptor antagonists or blockers and angiotensin converter enzyme inhibitors is they say that they're renoprotective, and there's no doubt they protect the kidney. So the idea is, or at least one of the ideas is, that they protect the kidney because they relieve this angiotensin vasoconstriction here and don't allow the glomerular capillary pressure to go up too much. So why is that important? Constantly elevated